Why ancient Romans used a shared sponge on a stick, the tersorium. Imagine walking into a public toilet in ancient Rome, not a private stall, not a porcelain seat, but a long stone bench riddled with holes, shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Beneath you, a flowing stream of water carries waste away. There is no privacy, no doors, no partitions. And when you're finished, there's no toilet paper. Instead, there's a sponge, damp, gray, threaded on the end of a wooden stick. You pick it up. So did the person before you, and the person before them. This was the tersorium, the shared solution to a universal need. In the heart of the Roman Empire, hygiene was advanced, by ancient standards. Aqueducts brought water from distant springs. Public baths were abundant. Latrines, too, were a fixture of civic life, often built near markets, theaters, and forums. But despite Rome's innovations, their sanitary practices were a strange blend of progress and danger. The tersorium, though efficient in design, may be one of the most stomach-turning tools ever devised in the name of cleanliness. The typical Roman latrine was a social space. Dozens of people might sit side by side, chatting, conducting business, even eating while using the facilities. Water channels beneath and in front of the bench carried waste and provided a shallow trough for rinsing the tersorium. Ideally, users would dip the sponge in vinegar water or salt water before and after use. But ideal conditions didn't always exist. Cleaning was inconsistent, sponges degraded, and users weren't always careful. The tersorium was meant to be communal. There were rarely enough for each individual, and most latrines lacked any system for sterilization. Some historians believe wealthier individuals may have brought personal versions, but for the masses it was shared over and over again. Inscriptions and graffiti from latrine walls hint at discomfort and resentment. One reads, "He who uses this sponge must pray to the gods for mercy." Another warns, "Beware the sponge, many diseases pass this way." And that warning wasn't wrong. The communal tersorium was a perfect vector for disease. Bacteria from feces, blood, and urine could easily linger in the sponge's porous fibers. If not thoroughly soaked in vinegar or brine, these sponges became breeding grounds for infection. Intestinal parasites, hepatitis, and bacterial infections likely spread with ease. Ironically, what Romans considered hygienic might have made them sicker. Yet the tersorium wasn't just about necessity, it was cultural. Romans viewed bodily functions differently than modern societies. Public defecation wasn't shameful. It was integrated into daily life, civic architecture, and even humor. Latrines were places to gossip, debate politics, and share the latest rumors. Some contained decorative mosaics and inscriptions. Others had statues of deities like Fortuna or Venus, suggesting an almost sacred attitude toward elimination. Roman engineers even designed self-flushing systems in some latrines. Sloped floors, continuous running water, and careful sewage placement were meant to reduce odors and carry waste efficiently. But despite their clever plumbing, the blind spot was always microbial. Germ theory wouldn't emerge for nearly 2,000 years. So the sponge on a stick, no matter how routinely rinsed, was seen as practical, even civil. The wealth divide also showed itself here. In elite homes, private toilets existed. Wealthy Romans might use wool, moss, or perfumed cloths, but for commoners, the tersorium was the standard. In military camps and rural towns, the same tool was passed along with the little thought to cleanliness. Archaeological digs have uncovered latrine remains with well-worn sponges preserved in mineral deposits, evidence that these were not disposable items, but used until they fell apart. And sometimes the tersorium was used as a weapon. Historical accounts mention slaves and soldiers punished with soiled sponges. Satirists wrote jokes about people being beaten with them. In one darkly comic tale, a senator allegedly suffered humiliation when a tersorium, freshly used, was hurled in anger during a drunken bathhouse brawl. Modern audiences recoil at the idea. But for Romans, the tersorium was an everyday object, like sandals or a cooking pot. It didn't inspire horror, just routine. And in that normalization lies the most fascinating contradiction of Roman life. They were simultaneously advanced and alarmingly unaware. Their aqueducts changed the world. Their sanitation spread illness. Their streets were marvels of urban planning, yet under every bench was a stick and sponge soaked in potential disease. The Roman world prized order, cleanliness, and practicality. The tersorium, despite its obvious flaws, fit that mold. It was reusable. It was simple. It worked. Until it didn't. Until it spread filth instead of fighting it. Until one sponge, shared among hundreds, turned from tool to threat. And in that small object, held in hand after hand, lies a hidden story of an empire that could move mountains, but never quite conquer its own bacteria. Public toilets had no privacy. Romans sat side by side. Imagine walking into a public restroom and finding no doors, no walls, no stalls, just a long, continuous stone bench perforated with evenly spaced holes. Already seated are strangers side by side, casually chatting, discussing the weather, politics, or their latest business venture, all while doing their business. In ancient Rome, this wasn't shocking. It was everyday life. Welcome to the Roman latrine, one of history's most revealing examples of how radically different the past can be from the present. Public toilets in ancient Rome were social, open, and unapologetically communal. They were designed for efficiency, yes, but also for interaction. For the Romans, bodily functions were not to be cloaked in shame. They were just another part of human life, deserving of architecture, discussion, and even divine protection. Most Roman latrines featured a long marble or stone bench, carved with circular or keyhole-shaped openings placed above a deep drainage trench. Fresh water ran continuously underneath to help carry away waste. In front of the bench ran another channel, filled with flowing water meant for rinsing the infamous tersorium, a communal cleaning tool consisting of a sponge attached to a wooden stick. After use, a Roman would dip the sponge in vinegar or salt water, give it a rinse in the channel, and leave it for the next person. What strikes modern minds even more is the total absence of privacy. No partitions, no screens. People sat inches apart. You could make eye contact. You could hear every noise. For Romans, this wasn't a humiliation. It was a civic experience. People came here to converse, to connect. This setting was a small stage of Roman life where all classes, except the enslaved, intersected. Senators, merchants, soldiers, and commoners might all relieve themselves in the same space, side by side. But let's not romanticize it too much. These facilities could be foul. Despite their clever engineering, latrines were often poorly ventilated. The stench of ammonia and methane hung in the air. Vermin, particularly rats and insects, were common, and there are even recorded accounts of snakes slithering up through the pipes to bite unsuspecting users. Explosions caused by built-up methane gas were a rare but real danger. Some Romans even carved protective spells or hung amulets nearby to ward off spirits they believed lurked in the sewers. And yet, despite these risks, the communal latrine endured. It was both a necessity and a cultural expression. In many ways, the latrine mirrored Roman ideals of openness and civic life. Private space was not sacred in Roman urban planning. Homes shared walls, streets teemed with neighbors, bathhouses bustled with nude conversation. Even the gods were involved. Latrines often featured small shrines or offerings to deities like Fortuna, Cloacina, goddess of the sewers, or even Venus to ensure health and safe passage of bodily functions. Interestingly, wealthy households did sometimes have private latrines, but even these were often tucked near kitchens or servant quarters, poorly ventilated, and sometimes shared. A noblewoman might use the commode with a servant present, holding perfume or water. The idea of complete solitude in such moments was alien. To be Roman was to be public. Archaeological remains across the empire, from Ostia to Pompeii to Ephesus, preserve these toilet sites with remarkable clarity. Rows of smooth, polished seats, water channels still visible, graffiti on the walls, inscriptions carved by bored or cheeky users. These latrines were not just for waste. They were repositories of culture, humor, superstition, and routine. The fact that Romans talked while seated in these places, that they laughed, gossiped, and sometimes even sang, tells us something profound. For them, the human body was not a thing to be hidden. It was integrated into their worldview, their spirituality, and their infrastructure. There was no shame in the necessary. There was only life, and life was public. Today, we cloak our restrooms in steel doors and white noise. We strive for silence and separation. But once, not long ago in the span of human history, people faced nature together, quite literally cheek to cheek. And in doing so, they revealed a society where participation in public life included even its most intimate moments. Roman engineers, known for their mastery of aqueducts and urban planning, also innovated in waste management. Their toilets often connected to sewer systems like the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's massive drainage artery that still flows today. This integration of toilets with urban sanitation made Rome cleaner than many later medieval cities, which abandoned such systems entirely. Yet, it wasn't just infrastructure, it was ideology. Romans believed that health was a civic responsibility. Public baths, fountains, and toilets were all part of this vision. Relief was not shameful. It was communal. To the Roman mind, hiding these activities might have seemed odd or even antisocial. What changed? As Christianity rose in the later empire, attitudes toward the body shifted. Modesty became a virtue. Public nudity declined. Toilet design began to evolve toward privacy. Over centuries, the communal latrine gave way to the private chamber. Shame, once absent, became standard. But for a brief and fascinating chapter in human history, Rome embraced a vision of hygiene without secrecy. Their latrines stand as quiet stone witnesses, not just to waste, but to the strange intimacy of an empire that did everything together, including this. So next time you close a stall door behind you, remember, you're stepping away from a world that once saw no need for it. In the ancient world, using the toilet wasn't a private moment of peace. It was a dangerous gamble. Long before the invention of modern plumbing, sanitation was crude, sewage systems were volatile, and the act of relieving oneself could come with unexpected terror. From methane explosions to snake attacks, history reveals a disturbing truth. The toilet was not always a safe space. In ancient Rome, public latrines were marvels of engineering by the standards of their time. Stone benches lined communal spaces with holes carved at regular intervals and channels beneath to carry away waste. The water used to rinse the system flowed continuously, sourced from aqueducts. But beneath the surface, literally, lurked a cocktail of filth, bacteria, and gas. Human waste, left to ferment in the warm darkness of the sewers, released dangerous levels of methane and hydrogen sulfide. In confined, poorly ventilated spaces, these gases could accumulate to explosive concentrations. All it took was the spark of a torch, commonly carried at night for visibility, or even the discharge of static electricity from woolen tunics or sandals to ignite an eruption. There are Roman records that describe sudden booms from beneath toilet seats, lifting users into the air or knocking them unconscious. Some accounts even speak of fatalities, where latrine-goers were found scorched or dazed in the aftermath. But fire wasn't the only threat lurking in the dark. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's massive sewer system, became a haven for vermin. Rats, snakes, scorpions, and even feral cats found warmth, food, and a maze of tunnels through which to move. Some creatures made their way up into latrines, entering through the drainage holes. Several horror stories speak of unsuspecting citizens being bitten in vulnerable places by rodents or serpents as they sat in presumed privacy. One infamous tale involves a Roman noblewoman who screamed so violently after a snake brushed her thigh mid-use that it drew a crowd. The snake was eventually killed, but the woman never used a public toilet again. Another story, though likely exaggerated, describes a rat clinging to a user and refusing to let go. The incident caused such panic that guards were stationed outside the latrine for weeks. The fear of these dangers led to all sorts of rituals and practices. Romans sometimes clapped loudly or stomped their feet before sitting to scare off any lurking creatures. Some latrines included small cages or barriers beneath the seats to block animals. Others used scented oils or burning herbs to cover the stench and mask the presence of gas. Even so, anxiety persisted. The toilets may have been public, but so too were the screams of those unlucky enough to encounter a surprise attack. The terror wasn't isolated to Rome. In medieval castles, sanitation had evolved little. Waste chutes called guardrobes emptied into cesspits below. These pits were rarely cleaned and became fermentation chambers of rotting matter, producing clouds of noxious gases. Lighting a candle or carrying a lantern into these confined stone latrines could prove deadly. There are records of guardrobes exploding from built-up methane, catching castle interiors on fire, and injuring nobles mid-use. In 1189, a report from an English manor describes a lord suffering burns after an explosion threw him off the wooden seat and ignited nearby rushes used for insulation. He survived, but refused to use the same chamber again. In France, entire towers had to be rebuilt after a guardrobe blast in the 14th century cracked stone walls and killed 2 servants. Compounding the danger was ignorance. People believed illness was caused by foul air, miasma, not bacteria or combustion. They recognized that the air around latrines was dangerous, but not why. The occasional explosion or animal attack was seen not as preventable, but as punishment, superstition, or divine wrath. Even into the Enlightenment, as cities grew denser and sewer systems became more intricate, the risks persisted. In Victorian London, the notorious Great Stink of 1858 forced Parliament to finally invest in underground sewer upgrades. But until then, many lavatories connected directly to cesspools beneath homes. Methane built up silently. A single match to light a candle could result in a deafening blast. Toilets erupted in bedrooms, kitchens, and shops. One documented case in 1889 from Scranton, Pennsylvania, tells of a lavatory that exploded so violently it tore through the second floor of a residence. The occupant was badly burned, and the incident made local headlines. Another report from Berlin in 1903 describes a school outhouse combusting, injuring 3 students, and prompting a citywide inspection of municipal waste lines. By the early 20th century, advances in ventilation and water traps finally began to mitigate these dangers. Sewer gases were redirected, and modern toilets included water-sealed bins to block backflow and pests. But the legacy of centuries of dangerous latrines remains etched in cultural memory and architecture. Some older cities still have sealed chambers and collapsed guardrobes hidden behind walls, their methane-rich histories forgotten but not erased. Today we may flush and forget, but history reminds us that, for much of human civilization, the simple act of using the toilet came with real danger. From flammable gases to fanged intruders, the latrine was not a sanctuary but a trapdoor into chaos. We sit in comfort now because our ancestors sat in fear. These stories, though often buried in footnotes and folklore, reveal how far we've come in understanding hygiene, engineering, and the invisible forces that dwell beneath our feet. And perhaps the next time you sit in peace, you'll be just a little more grateful for the silent miracle of modern plumbing. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's giant sewer, was also a religious symbol. Beneath the grandeur of ancient Rome, below the marble temples, the echoing forums, the clatter of sandals on stone streets, flowed something darker. A river of filth, blood, rain, and sacrifice. A place where waste was carried away, but something else lingered. A belief, a reverence, a god. This was the Cloaca Maxima. At first glance, it seemed simple. One of the world's earliest and most ambitious sewer systems, built in the 6th century BCE under the orders of Rome's legendary kings. Its purpose? To drain the marshes between the Palatine and Capitoline hills and make the land fit for civilization. But over time, it became far more than a feat of engineering. The Cloaca Maxima became a symbol of order, of power, and of something sacred. This wasn't just about sewage, it was about survival. Rome grew fast, rising from a small kingdom to a sprawling metropolis of over 1 million people. Streets overflowed with people, animals, marketplaces, baths. Without a way to manage the waste, both literal and spiritual, the city would drown in its own filth. The Cloaca Maxima became the artery through which the city's impurities were carried into the Tiber River. But for many Romans it wasn't just a sewer, it was a mouth, the mouth of the underworld. The word cloaca itself means drain, but the Romans did not treat it with disdain. They built temples near its outlets. Priests performed rites to honor the spirit of the sewer. Offerings were made, coins were thrown into its murky waters, not just to rid Rome of refuse, but to cleanse the city's soul. In some traditions it was believed that the goddess Cloacina, protector of purity, watched over this great channel. This was not superstition on the fringe. Emperors and senators accepted it. The temple of Venus Cloacina stood proudly above a segment of the sewer near the Roman Forum. Marriage rituals, purification ceremonies, and even state rituals involved invoking her name. Cleanliness in Rome was political, spiritual, and sacred. But the Cloaca Maxima was not kind. It was immense, tall enough to stand in, vast enough to swallow animals, garbage, and even the bodies of the condemned. Slaves who cleaned its passages risked disease and death. Legends spoke of spirits haunting the depths. Some believed the sewer itself had moods, backing up during omens, roaring louder before catastrophes. And sometimes sacrifices were made. The practical danger was real. Floods could carry raw sewage through the city, bringing disease with it. Blockages led to stench and decay. But fear also gave it power. For Romans, purity wasn't just about clean streets, it was about cosmic balance. The Cloaca Maxima wasn't just plumbing, it was part of the divine machinery that kept the world running. Its construction was almost supernatural for its time. Huge stone vaults, some dating back more than 2,500 years, still hold today. Modern engineers have marveled at its longevity, its design. The fact that parts of it are still in use, still draining Rome to this day, speaks volumes. To walk through ancient Rome without knowing what lies beneath is to miss the beating heart of a civilization that dared to conquer the world, yet feared what festered below its streets. The Cloaca Maxima was a paradox, an object of utility, yet revered like a deity. Its name was whispered with both respect and revulsion. It was the symbol of the Roman capacity to harness nature, not just rivers and roads, but rot and ruin. There are stories of senators pausing to nod respectfully at vents where the sewer breathed steam into the streets. Some claim to hear the voice of the goddess Cloacina in the echoes of rushing water, her presence invoked when Rome sought cleansing of bodies, of sins, of politics. In a society where omens were read in entrails and divine favor could dictate battle, even sewage became sacred. The engineers who carved the Cloaca Maxima from stone were not just builders, they were guardians of purity. Layer by layer, the channel was widened, reinforced, expanded to match the growing hunger of a city that never slept. Rain and blood, wine and urine, all flowed through the same mouth, and still it held. Its influence extended beyond function. Roman authors referenced it in poems and plays. Historians described it with awe. The sewer became metaphor, a symbol of control over chaos, of the state's ability to manage not only its people, but their waste, their guilt, their shadows. And perhaps that's why it endured. Even as plagues swept the empire, as emperors rose and fell, as gods were born and buried, beneath it all, the Cloaca Maxima flowed on. It was the thread that bound the sacred and profane, the foundation beneath civilization's marble skin. Long before the modern world built its networks of sanitation and purification, Rome had already declared, "No greatness is possible without confronting what lies below." In worshiping a sewer, they were admitting something few societies dare, that our filth defines us as surely as our philosophy. Over time, the rituals faded. Christianity replaced Roman gods, and Cloacina was forgotten, but the sewer remained. Silent, steady, eternal. For centuries it kept the eternal city alive, quietly carrying away what no one wanted to see, even as its sacred meaning slipped beneath the surface. Today, tourists pass above it, unaware. They photograph temples, toss coins into the Trevi fountain, and never realize the true wishing well lies beneath their feet. A channel once honored like a god. The Cloaca Maxima reminds us that even civilizations as mighty as Rome understood something we often forget. That purity is not just beauty, but balance. That to build something great, you must first manage what lies beneath. Rome was not ashamed of its filth. It gave it a name. It gave it a face. It built a temple in its honor. And 2,000 years later, the sewer still flows, haunted by faith, fed by history, and held together by stone, sacrifice, and the strange sanctity of waste. Urine was collected and sold as a cleaning agent. In the grand mosaic of ancient Rome, a civilization celebrated for its architectural marvels, military conquests, and refined culture, there lies a practice so unexpected, so pungent in truth, that modern sensibilities recoil at its mention. It was a time when status was displayed in marble baths and scented oils, yet the secret ingredient behind cleanliness, hygiene, and even profit was human urine. Yes, in ancient Rome, urine was not waste, it was commodity. Rich in ammonia, a powerful cleaning agent, urine became central to a wide array of daily Roman practices. Its use was not whispered or hidden. It was openly collected, transported, and taxed by emperors. It scrubbed clothes, bleached fabric, tanned leather, and astonishingly was even used to brighten smiles. Urine's journey from bodily byproduct to commercial asset began with the Roman Polonica, industrial-scale laundries scattered across the empire. These bustling workshops were run by fullers, the professionals responsible for cleaning the city's togas and tunics. In the Polonica, garments were placed in large vats filled with a mixture of water and urine. Workers, often slaves or freedmen, would then stomp barefoot on the clothes for hours, agitating the fabric so the ammonia could lift dirt, oil, and grime. The effect was remarkable. Whites emerged cleaner, fabric softened, and stains erased. The pungent smell was part of the process. After the wash, clothes were rinsed, dried, and sometimes scented with herbs to mask any lingering odor. And in a society where appearance equaled status, a well-cleaned tunic could signal dignity and discipline, even if it had just been bathed in urine. Urine was also used in leather tanning, where its acidic nature helped soften hides and remove hair. Roman barbers and dentists, too, incorporated it into their trade. Some sources suggest that diluted urine was used to whiten teeth, its ammonia acting as a crude form of bleaching. While the thought turns modern stomachs, in Roman times, white teeth were a status symbol, and no price or taste was too high. Public urinals, known as Polonica pots, were placed in streets and near workshops specifically for urine collection. Citizens would relieve themselves directly into these receptacles, knowing their contribution had value. This was not a fringe activity, it was integrated into Rome's economic infrastructure. Collectors would gather the pots, transport the liquid to laundries or tanneries, and sell it in bulk. Then came Emperor Vespasian, who in the 1st century A.D. turned this biological necessity into imperial revenue. Facing financial shortfalls after civil war, Vespasian imposed a tax on public urinals. Known as the vectigal urinae, this tax applied to urine collected for industrial use. When his son Titus mocked the policy, Vespasian reportedly held up a coin and asked, "Does it smell?" When Titus replied, "No," Vespasian retorted, "Yet it comes from urine." The phrase, "money doesn't stink," pecunia non olet, was born, and it has echoed through the ages. This tax sparked debate in Roman society. Some viewed it as a clever economic stroke. Others found it vulgar, taxing something so base. But the tax remained, and Rome's streets continued to funnel liquid gold into its industries. The workers in the Pholoniki, however, endured harsh conditions. Stomping through tubs of urine day after day, exposed to fumes and skin irritation, they toiled for hours in the heat. The job was essential but lowly. Nobody praised the fullers, even as society relied on them. Still, many found steady work, and some even grew prosperous, opening larger laundries or diversifying into textile production. What's remarkable is not just that the Romans used urine, but how they systematized it. They recognized its chemical value, integrated it into state policy, taxed it, traded it, and built industry upon it. This wasn't mere folk remedy. It was chemistry, commerce, and practicality woven into one. As centuries passed and empires fell, the practice faded, but traces of it endured in medieval Europe, where urine was still used in some textile processes. The idea of cleaning with ammonia derived from waste lingered, eventually replaced by synthetic chemicals as science advanced. But the core principle, that even the most unlikely substances can be repurposed, remains a curious legacy of Roman ingenuity. Today, when we think of Rome, we think of aqueducts, amphitheaters, and emperors. But beneath that glory was a civilization both practical and unflinching. They made use of every resource, no matter how unglamorous. In Roman hands, even waste became wealth. The next time you marvel at the polished white marble of Roman ruins, remember this: it might have once gleamed brighter thanks to a bucket of urine, a barefoot fuller, and an emperor wise enough to see profit where others saw only waste. In Rome, even filth had value, and nothing, not even the contents of a chamber pot, escaped the empire's grasp. Public toilets were often filthy and smelled terrible. Imagine entering a Roman public toilet in the height of the empire, not a quiet stall or private booth, but a long, open bench packed with strangers. You sit side by side, knees nearly touching. Beneath the bench, a shallow water channel slowly moves, dark waste toward an unseen drain. There's no flush, no soap, and very little airflow. The stench hits you instantly, raw, organic, ancient. The heat of the day has cooked the odors into the walls. Your eyes water. You try not to breathe. This was not exceptional. This was expected. In Rome, public toilets were everywhere, and most of them were unbearable. Though Rome's engineering remains legendary, its public toilets were often a paradox, impressive in design, but revolting in experience. The Romans built hundreds of latrines across their empire. Some were attached to bathhouses. Others stood alone near markets or public squares. They featured rows of stone seats, communal sponges, and water channels designed to carry away waste. But in practice, these features were rarely maintained as intended. Water levels dropped, flow slowed, and what remained was a swamp of disease and decay. Running water was supposed to cleanse the system, but Rome's infrastructure couldn't keep up with its population. Latrines became clogged, water stagnated, and the smell, overpowering, inescapable, became a defining feature of city life. Roman writers mention the odor frequently, not as an exception, but as a fact of life. Martial, the poet, once joked that someone's breath reminded him of a latrine. Seneca warned visitors to avoid certain bathhouses because the air inside was saturated with human stench. The danger wasn't just to the nose. Public toilets were biological minefields. Waste buildup attracted flies, rats, and even snakes. The ammonia from urine mixed with rotting matter to form a pungent haze that clung to skin and clothing. In some poorly ventilated latrines, methane gas built up to explosive levels. There are recorded incidents of latrine explosions when a torch or oil lamp triggered a blast. People were injured. Some died. Roman engineers understood that these risks existed. Ventilation shafts and drainage upgrades were attempted, but rarely sustained. Users often carried their own cloths, perfumes, or garlands of herbs to cover their faces while inside. Wealthier citizens avoided public toilets altogether, using chamber pots or private commodes. But for the poor, there was no alternative. Latrines were public, open, and relentlessly foul. The design, while logical, left much to be desired. Most public toilets lacked doors or partitions. You were visible to all. Worse, some had no seats, just holes over pits. These pits filled quickly and were rarely emptied properly. Even when aqueduct water was available, it was often rerouted for more prestigious uses like fountains or baths. Toilets came last. And as the empire aged, maintenance declined. Water pressure dropped. Workers stopped coming. Toilets became pits of slow decay. There were no sanitation workers as we know them. Slaves or low-caste laborers were assigned the grueling task of cleaning out cesspits with buckets. These men worked in the dark, breathing in fumes, dragging out filth by hand. Their deaths were common. The job was considered cursed. In fact, some Romans believed that demons, malicious spirits, lived in toilets. They blamed hauntings, illness, and accidents on these unseen entities. Latrine amulets and charms were popular. Some toilets even had carvings of gods meant to ward off evil. To make matters worse, the communal sponge, the infamous tersorium, was used by all. Dipped in vinegar or salt water, it was meant to cleanse. But in overcrowded, poorly maintained latrines, this tool became a breeding ground for bacteria. If you think the smell was unbearable, the risk was even worse. Gastrointestinal illnesses, parasites, and skin infections could easily pass from user to user. There were no sterilization methods, no soap, and little concern for hygiene beyond rinsing in shared water that was already teeming with microbes. Even more disturbing was how the poor had to adapt. Some resorted to defecating in the streets or alleyways, contributing to widespread contamination. The smell of the city was not just found in toilets, it was everywhere. It clung to the lower neighborhoods, thickened in summer, and turned storm drains into open-air cesspits. The urban stench became a class marker. To be clean was a privilege. To stink was the default of poverty. Despite the empire's wealth and ingenuity, it had no concept of microbial life. Disease outbreaks were blamed on bad air, divine punishment, or cosmic imbalance. Latrines were cursed not for their bacteria, but for their demons. People whispered of spirits that emerged from pits, grasped ankles, and dragged victims down. Whether myth or metaphor, the fear was real, and it reflected the daily horror of using such places. Some cities tried to reform. A few latrines were redesigned with improved runoff, airflow, or added fragrance. Incense was burned. Perfumed oils were rubbed beneath the nostrils. But these were surface solutions to a systemic failure. The empire had stretched too wide, built too fast, infrastructure crumbled, cleanliness gave way to filth, and the latrine, once a marvel, became a place where dignity went to die. So when we walk Roman ruins today, admiring the stones and arches, we forget what they once held. The sound, the stench, the suffering. These were not serene spaces of classical calm, but raw, crowded, foul rooms where civilization met its limits. It is a reminder that even the greatest empires could not master waste, that under every marble column, beneath every tiled floor, there was always a pit, filling, festering, and forgotten. Wealthy Romans had indoor toilets, but they still reeked. In the grandeur of ancient Roman villas, surrounded by mosaics, marble pillars, and lush courtyards, one might imagine that every corner reflected wealth and refinement. And to an extent, it did. Wealthy Romans lived in homes that boasted private baths, heated floors, frescoed walls, and yes, even indoor toilets. But hidden beneath this elegance was a putrid secret. Those indoor toilets still reeked. While the Roman elite were pioneers of luxury, their indoor plumbing systems were a work in progress. Private latrines were often tucked near the kitchen or behind servant quarters, usually positioned directly above a cesspit. This pit collected human waste without modern seals or ventilation, which meant odors had a free pass to drift upward into the home. The wealthy had achieved comfort in many ways, but the scent of sewage still permeated their lives. Toilets were often small stone or wooden seats with a hole carved out, sometimes perched above a terracotta pipe or stone channel. These led to pits that had to be manually emptied, or, in better cases, connected to public sewers like the Cloaca Maxima. But connection didn't guarantee cleanliness. If the main sewer backed up or flooded, waste could easily flow the wrong direction, right back into the home. Many elite houses used rainwater cisterns or rudimentary water flow to wash waste away. But during dry seasons, or when water was rationed, these systems faltered. The stench would settle in. Flies and vermin would gather. Roman writers like Seneca and Martial even joked about the lingering smell in noble homes, hinting at a truth that the marble walls couldn't mask. To counteract the odor, wealthy families burned incense, placed garlands of herbs, or set bowls of perfumed oil near the toilet. Servants might be tasked with sweeping and freshening the space daily, but these efforts only masked, not eliminated, the problem. Some homes even had designated slaves to maintain the latrine area, called foricari, whose thankless job was to clean what others would not even acknowledge. Despite the odor, the indoor toilet remained a status symbol. To host guests without requiring them to visit a public latrine was a mark of dignity. Yet, even in homes of the aristocracy, the private toilet was no sanctuary. It was an unsealed opening to a decaying pit of waste, sometimes just inches below the floorboards. And when heat and humidity increased, so did the power of the smell. Worse still, these cesspits were breeding grounds for disease. Though Romans understood the concept of cleanliness, they lacked germ theory. Toilets and waste systems were not disinfected, just emptied, often by enslaved workers carrying buckets through alleyways. In some neighborhoods, these buckets were dumped into canals or fields, contaminating water supplies and spreading illness. Wealth also didn't insulate homeowners from accidents. There are accounts of cesspits collapsing under weight, swallowing rooms and people. In one case, a guest at a banquet fell into a partially covered latrine pit during a garden party, a mishap immortalized in Roman satire. Despite all their engineering, the risk of collapse, overflow, and toxic buildup was real. In comparison to the sprawling, frescoed bathing complexes of Rome, the toilet was a humble and neglected space. Romans took pride in their public baths, but spoke less of the private latrine. It was a space of necessity, not of status. Even emperors were not immune to its hazards. One tale tells of a minor noble who died after inhaling too much methane while inspecting a blocked pipe. Yet the Roman toilet, for all its flaws, was a marvel for its time. Few ancient civilizations integrated indoor waste disposal into their homes. The problem wasn't vision, it was materials and biology. Without U-bends, airtight seals, or chemical cleaners, smell and danger were constant companions. The elite endured it because they had no better choice. Indoor latrines, even in the most sophisticated Roman villas, reveal a contradiction at the heart of Roman engineering, brilliant design constrained by limited sanitation science. The same civilization that could construct aqueducts across valleys and build heated floors still could not solve the basic problem of odor control and waste isolation. Their toilets had style, but not hygiene. Some elite homes had multiple toilets, one near the kitchen, another by the baths, and occasionally one in a guest room. These weren't choices born of convenience alone, they were status signals. Even the layout of the home reflected Roman social hierarchy. A latrine near the atrium might be used by household members, while one closer to the garden was designated for guests. But all were connected to the same dilemma. How do you hide the smell of a hole in the floor? The answer often was, you don't. The Roman response was to accept the odor as a fact of life and to decorate around it. Mosaic floors near toilets featured geometric designs, masks, or even mythological scenes, perhaps an attempt to distract the senses. Rooms were painted with deep reds and earthy hues, and in wealthier homes, bronze fixtures and carved lids adorned the commode. But a beautiful seat doesn't cancel the foul air below it. Excavations in Pompeii and Herculaneum have unearthed latrine rooms in some of the most luxurious homes of the empire. Their placement often reveals how architecture bent to practicality. In smaller houses, latrines were squeezed between walls. In grander homes, they were given small rooms of their own, sometimes next to the triclinium, or dining room, an unsettling juxtaposition by today's standards. Even with these risks and discomforts, indoor latrines marked a leap forward. In a world where most people relieved themselves in alleys, ditches, or communal pits, having any kind of private facility was an extraordinary privilege. But it was a flawed privilege, one that came with flies, mold, and the constant awareness that beneath the artful facade, decay waited. In many ways, this is what makes Roman domestic life so fascinating. The very rich could afford grand illusions of power, control, refinement. But nature could not be fooled. Without airtight systems, waste crept back into their lives, silently eroding the luxury above. And so the marble homes of Rome bore a hidden rot, one that no mosaic could mask and no fortune could escape. Even today, archaeologists studying these toilets must wear protective gear, not because of modern contamination, but because the old cesspits still hold centuries of bacteria. The stench may be gone, but the truth remains, fossilized in the stone. For all their civilization, even the best of the Romans still lived with the stink of their own success. Toilet-related curses were etched on bathroom walls. Toilets in the ancient world weren't just places for physical relief. They were also sites of raw emotion, whispered secrets, and supernatural revenge. For archaeologists, the walls of public latrines have become unlikely archives, preserving curses, confessions, and grievances etched into stone, scratched into plaster, or left behind as tablets tossed beneath the seat. Far from silent spaces, these ancient bathrooms were full of voices, some furious, some fearful, and many fascinating. In the Roman Empire, communal latrines were social spaces where people gathered not just to relieve themselves, but to talk, gossip, and even conduct business. With no stalls or privacy, people sat side by side, often for extended periods. This strange mixture of intimacy and exposure made the latrine a unique environment, one where people's frustrations, heartbreaks, and suspicions sometimes found a dark and supernatural outlet. Across the ruins of Roman Britain, Pompeii, and North Africa, archaeologists have uncovered curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with incantations, often rolled and nailed to walls or dropped into sewer grates. Some were pleas to the gods to punish a thief who stole a cloak or coin. Others were much more personal, aimed at unfaithful lovers, dishonest business partners, or rivals who had shamed the writer. The idea was that by placing the curse in a liminal space like a toilet, close to the underworld and full of symbolic filth, the gods of vengeance might listen more closely. One such tablet, discovered near a latrine in Bath, England, reads, "To the goddess Sulis, I give to your divinity and majesty my stolen cloak and bathing tunic. Do not allow sleep or health to the one who has wronged me until it is returned." The message isn't just about a theft. It's about vengeance, a spiritual demand for balance written in a place where the sacred and profane collided. In Pompeii, cursed tablets were often paired with symbolic items, nails, hair, or even bits of blood, to empower the words. Some were folded tightly and pierced to trap the offender's spirit. The latrine offered a literal and symbolic pathway to the gods of the underworld. The stench, the darkness, the ritual, all combined to form a primitive, visceral courtroom of personal justice. But curses weren't the only messages left behind. Latrine walls in places like Pompeii are covered in graffiti, rude jokes, political slogans, declarations of love, and biting insults. Some scratched lines read like early versions of social media posts, complete with names. "Lucius is a liar." "Marcia, you are not as beautiful as you think." One reads, "Apollinaris, the doctor of the emperor, defecated well here." Another boldly proclaims, "Secundus defecated here 3 times in one night." Whether meant as humor or humiliation, the latrine became a canvas for human expression. What makes these messages so compelling is their honesty. People wrote what they dared not say aloud. In societies where class, gender, and etiquette controlled speech, the toilet offered anonymity and a moment of rebellious clarity. You could curse your superior, mock your rival, or profess forbidden love, all without consequences. Unless, of course, the gods were listening. Some curses were remarkably detailed. One tablet, found in a sewer drain, listed the full name and occupation of a cheating lover, followed by instructions to the gods to bind his tongue, rot his entrails, and sour his wine. Others were written backward or pierced with nails to intensify their magical potency. A few were smeared with human waste, an unholy combination of ritual and rage. One particularly vengeful curse from North Africa called upon spirits of the dead to choke the breath of a rival and twist his spine like the roots of an olive tree. Historians believe that these latrine curses served as emotional release valves in a world that offered few outlets for personal justice. Without courts for the poor or social mobility for the scorned, divine punishment was the last hope. The toilet, with its association to the underworld, became a symbolic gateway where the boundaries between the mortal and divine blurred. And within that blur, desperation found its voice. It wasn't just Rome. Similar toilet curses have been found in ancient Greece, where public restrooms were etched with hexes to Artemis or Hecate. In Mesopotamia, tablets left near cesspits invoked gods of pestilence to strike down unfaithful spouses. In early Islamic bathhouses, scribes recorded talismanic phrases meant to ward off demons said to dwell in shadowy corners. While the styles varied, the impulse was the same, to leave behind something more than waste, to inscribe a cry for justice or revenge in a place where no one expected to find sacred words. Today, these curses offer historians more than amusement. They open windows into ancient daily life, who people loved, who betrayed them, what they feared, and how they fought back when powerless. They reveal a depth of emotion rarely seen in official records or temple inscriptions. They show that even in the most private moments, people needed to speak, to rage, to beg, to curse, and the bathroom wall was their paper. So the next time you scroll through a bathroom wall covered in Sharpie scribbles, remember, it's not a modern invention. It's a tradition thousands of years old, a legacy of anger, love, sarcasm, and sorcery, all whispered in the most unexpected of places. Roman soldiers dug makeshift toilets at camps, but often got sick. Anyway, Roman soldiers were among the most disciplined and organized fighting forces in ancient history. Their legions built roads, forged empires, and carved their presence across continents. But beneath the glint of armor and precision of formation was a quieter, filthier truth, one that made even the mightiest warriors fall. They were dying from their own waste. Every time a Roman legion moved to set up camp, whether deep in the forests of Germania, on the windswept plains of Britannia, or across the burning sands of Africa, the first structures raised weren't walls or watchtowers. They were latrines, makeshift toilets dug into the earth, trenches carved out with the same precision as their battle lines. These weren't random holes. They were part of a larger discipline. Camp hygiene was considered crucial to maintaining strength and morale. Latrines were typically placed on the outskirts of camp, away from sleeping quarters and cooking stations. Soldiers used wooden benches with holes, and water channels, sometimes carved directly into the earth, helped wash away waste. Buckets of sand or vinegar-soaked sponges were used in place of toilet paper. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it often failed. Because while Roman engineering was advanced, nature and war were unpredictable. Heavy rains could flood trenches, spreading human waste into living areas. Sometimes latrines were dug too close to water sources. And in the chaos of moving quickly between battles, hygiene became an afterthought. Latrine trenches were reused too often, slopes were misjudged, contaminated tools were shared. The result was disease, dysentery, typhoid, parasitic infections. Entire camps of strong, battle-hardened men brought to their knees not by arrows or swords, but by diarrhea, fever, and dehydration. Roman military records, even in fragments, mention flux sweeping through legions. Some died in their tents. Others suffered so badly they couldn't stand for battle. Doctors in the Roman army, known as medici, did what they could. They administered herbal tinctures, recommended fasting, or wine-soaked sponges, and sometimes bled soldiers to balance the humors. But without germ theory, they had no understanding of what caused these plagues. They didn't know that human waste seeped into groundwater, that flies carried bacteria from latrines to mess halls, that the very structure meant to keep them clean could poison them instead. Ironically, Roman civilization prided itself on sanitation. In cities, aqueducts and public baths were celebrated symbols of health and hygiene. Latrines in Rome itself were marvels, stone seats above flowing water, complete with drainage systems and cleaning tools. But on the front lines, far from marble and mosaic, soldiers dug holes and hoped for the best. The army developed rules. Latrines had to be dug a certain depth. Each trench had to be burned or buried after use. Officers inspected the sanitation setup. There were even designated soldiers assigned to maintain the toilets, an unglamorous but critical job. But still, outbreaks happened, especially in siege conditions where camps grew overcrowded, supplies ran thin, and waste disposal was nearly impossible. There are reports of enemy forces targeting Roman hygiene deliberately, polluting streams, driving waste uphill with animal herds, or poisoning nearby wells. The battlefield wasn't just about weapons, it was about water. Even the famed Roman discipline had limits. Veterans recalled sickness sweeping through legions faster than any invading army. Letters speak of soldiers too weak to lift shields, lying in rows, moaning through the night, while flies buzzed and latrines overflowed. And yet, these moments rarely made the history books. Glorious conquests were recorded in detail, victories carved in stone, but the image of a centurion doubled over from dysentery? That was forgotten. But it happened, repeatedly, silently, shamefully, because even the strongest army in the world cannot escape the reality of the human body. For an empire so obsessed with control of land, people, and fate, Rome's failure to master its own waste was a fatal contradiction. Military training emphasized discipline in everything, from the precision of spear formations to the alignment of tents. A Roman camp was a machine, and every cog had its place. But waste didn't follow rules. And when it seeped beyond the boundaries of those carefully planned trenches, it turned order into chaos. Commanders kept sanitation logs. Some camps even employed early forms of latrine inspection. The most efficient legions knew how to build latrines with wooden or stone seats, ventilation shafts, and small drainage ditches. But the further the army ventured from Rome, the more improvised the solutions became. In harsh terrains, toilets became shallow pits with no protections. And still, soldiers marched. Still, they dug. Still, they suffered. The stink of a neglected latrine could suffocate a camp's morale faster than a battlefield defeat. Fresh recruits, already shaken by the brutality of training, often broke down under the toll of sickness. Their dignity was stripped not by enemy blades, but by endless shivering trips to the trench in the dead of night. Camps left behind stories, but also graves. Mass graves filled not just by swords and spears, but by the invisible assault of microbes and filth. Archaeologists have found traces of intestinal parasites in latrine sites and skeletal remains marked by malnutrition, evidence that disease did more damage than war itself. Even high-ranking officers weren't spared. Command tents were kept at the center of camp, yet no distance was enough when waste was mismanaged. When latrines overflowed, or when wind carried stench through the ranks, disease didn't discriminate. The entire machine ground to a halt. This was Rome's quiet war. The empire would eventually build permanent military settlements with more sophisticated sanitation. They'd lay stone drains, raise aqueduct-fed baths, and establish stricter hygiene protocols. But the early centuries were marked by trial, by error, and by suffering. The lesson was clear: neglect the latrine and the legion rots from within. And in every shovel of dirt, in every trench dug beneath a blood-red sky, that lesson was buried, again and again. The next time you picture a Roman legion, don't just see the glint of shields or the march of sandals. Imagine the stink, the fever, the desperate prayer of a soldier, not for victory, but for a clean trench, and a moment's relief from the empire's most silent enemy. Because the Romans didn't just fight their foes, they fought their own filth, and often they lost. There was no toilet paper, only water, leaves, or wool. In ancient Rome, a civilization known for its stunning aqueducts, public baths, and innovative engineering, there was one humble modern luxury they lacked entirely: toilet paper. While the empire spanned continents, unified currencies, and codified laws, the act of personal hygiene after defecation was far less refined. Romans had to make do with what nature and ingenuity allowed: water, leaves, wool, or if fortune smiled upon them, a communal sponge on a stick, the infamous tersorium. For the average Roman, relieving oneself was not a private affair. Public latrines dotted cities like Rome, Pompeii, and Ostia. These were open communal spaces, long stone benches with evenly spaced holes carved into them, often without partitions. Beneath the seating, a constant flow of water from aqueducts washed away the waste. Conversations continued as people sat side by side, exposing the intimate act to the rhythms of daily life. Privacy was sacrificed in the name of efficiency, and the act of sanitation was folded into the social world. The tersorium, perhaps the most infamous Roman hygiene tool, was a sponge attached to a wooden stick. After using the toilet, a person would dip the tersorium into a channel of running water that often included vinegar or salt to sanitize it, then use it to wipe. It was then rinsed again and left for the next person. In busy latrines, this meant hundreds of people sharing the same cleaning tool throughout the day. While functional, it was hardly sanitary by modern standards. But the tersorium was not universally accessible. The lower classes, those who didn't frequent public bathhouses or couldn't afford the fee, had to find their own solutions. In poorer homes or rural areas, people used what was available: leaves plucked from nearby trees, handfuls of straw, tufts of moss, smooth river stones, or even pottery shards known as pessoi. These pieces of broken clay were sometimes inscribed with the names of enemies or unpopular politicians, a crude fusion of hygiene and protest. The pessoi were often rounded to avoid cutting the skin, but even so, their use could be uncomfortable and risk infection. Archaeological finds across the Roman world have uncovered these small ceramic discs, smoothed by use and time, indicating that even in the absence of softness, Romans prioritized function. More fortunate Romans, typically the wealthy, had access to wool or linen cloth, used once and discarded or washed. This luxury was reserved for the elite and used behind the closed doors of private latrines within grand villas. Some households may have even used scented water or oils post-defecation, elevating the process into a ritual of comfort. But these were exceptions in a world where the average citizen braved the stone slabs of public toilets and the rough touch of whatever material was at hand. Sanitation in Roman times was advanced in some ways: latrines connected to sewer systems, water constantly flowing to remove waste, but deeply flawed in others. The reuse of tersoria, the absence of soap, and the communal nature of defecation created a breeding ground for disease. Flies swarmed open waste channels. The smell, while masked by incense or oils in some places, often pervaded entire districts. Yet it was accepted as part of daily life. Even in bathhouses, considered sanctuaries of cleanliness, the cycle was never entirely clean. Slaves or attendants might carry fresh water or perfume cloths, but they too often shared sponges and cleaning tools between dozens of patrons. Germ theory was centuries away. To the Romans, cleanliness was more a matter of removing visible dirt than eliminating invisible pathogens. Reliefs, graffiti, and satirical writings occasionally referenced these practices, though few detailed descriptions survive. The tersorium, for example, is rarely shown in art, its role understood but not celebrated. It was a quiet companion to empire, tucked away in latrine corners, soaked in vinegar and anonymity. The Roman attitude toward bodily functions was complex. On one hand, they were remarkably open. Bathhouses, public urination, and shared latrines normalized these acts. On the other, there was a social hierarchy tied even to how one wiped. To use wool marked you as affluent. To use a shard of pottery meant you were enduring. Interestingly, these Roman practices didn't entirely vanish with the empire. Throughout the medieval period and beyond, wiping remained a challenge, met with local improvisation: hay in the countryside, lace in the courts of France, newspaper in Victorian London. Toilet paper as we know it didn't become widespread until the 19th century. In this way, Roman habits echoed through time, their rough edges only gradually softened. When we look at the grandeur of Roman civilization, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the roads stretching to every corner of the empire, it's easy to forget the mundane realities of daily life. But in every Roman home, from imperial palace to countryside shack, the same question echoed after every visit to the latrine: what now? Their answers were ingenious, if imperfect. They adapted, endured, and wiped as best they could. And in that humble act, we find a strange kinship with the ancients, a reminder that no matter how mighty an empire, its citizens still had to answer nature's call. Toilet gods existed, like Cloacina, the goddess of the sewer. Imagine needing divine protection just to use the bathroom, not because of superstition, but because the people around you believed that lurking in the shadows of the sewer were spirits, disease bringers, shame demons, unclean gods who could strike you ill in your most vulnerable moment. For the Romans, this wasn't fantasy. It was faith. And at the heart of it stood a goddess, Cloacina, the protector of the sewers, a deity born not in temples, but in the putrid darkness beneath the empire's feet. Cloacina, whose name stems from the Latin cloaca, or sewer, was originally a minor Etruscan water deity. But in Rome, she gained a cult following, an actual shrine near the Roman Forum, dedicated to the divine spirit of the Cloaca Maxima, the city's central sewage system. She wasn't just a symbol of hygiene. She was invoked during moments of danger. Because to the Romans, entering a public toilet meant entering a threshold between order and chaos. Bathrooms in ancient Rome were social but risky. Disease, stench, and even explosions from built-up methane made latrines perilous places. But beyond physical threats, Romans feared spiritual impurity. The toilet was seen as a liminal space, a boundary between the human world and the underworld. Sewers weren't just waste canals, they were viewed as portals. Openings to realms where forgotten gods and vengeful spirits lived. Using the latrine without protection was akin to walking into a haunted temple unarmed. So they prayed, not loudly, but quietly. A whispered invocation to Cloacina, a talisman carried in a pocket, a mural painted over a toilet seat depicting her or other guardian figures. In some homes, especially wealthier villas, miniature shrines were erected near lavatories. Offerings, small coins, flowers, or burned incense were left near drainage grates, appealing for mercy and safety during an act as ordinary as defecation. Cloacina was not the only spirit tied to this strange realm. The Romans also recognized the lemures, restless dead who might emerge from the underworld to torment the living, especially in places where bodily boundaries broke down. Latrines, bathhouses, and sewers were among the most haunted. Rituals like the Lemuria festival were meant to pacify these spirits, driving them back with sacred chants and offerings. Inscriptions discovered near Roman toilets reveal pleas for safety, inscriptions invoking purification, and graffiti joking about toilet demons. Even the tersorium, the infamous shared sponge, was treated with superstitious care. Dipping it into salt or vinegar wasn't just for cleaning. Salt was sacred. Vinegar had ritual significance. To cleanse was to sanctify, not just disinfect. The fusion of hygiene and holiness was everywhere. Public latrines often bore protective symbols, eyes to ward off the evil eye, phallic amulets to repel malevolent forces. The boundaries of bathroom space were marked with more than walls. They were lined with ritual. Even the act of relieving oneself was loaded with meaning. To rid the body of waste was to risk pollution of the spirit, unless protected by divine watchers, like Cloacina. What's remarkable is that this belief system coexisted with Rome's architectural brilliance. The Cloaca Maxima itself was a marvel of civil engineering, still partially intact today. It carried rainwater, refuse, and waste through a network of tunnels that kept the city functional. But Romans didn't view it purely as infrastructure. They treated it as alive, an entity, a vein beneath the city that breathed and pulsed and needed to be appeased. Cloacina's shrine, though small, was treated with reverence. Located near the Forum, it featured a statue and an altar. Citizens would pass by and nod in respect. Some sources even claim it was where the peace treaty between the Romans and Sabines was sanctified, further tying the goddess to order, unity, and public well-being. Even emperors paid their respects. It was said that Vespasian, famous for taxing public urinals, acknowledged the gods of waste management. When criticized for profiting from human excretion, he allegedly held a coin to his nose and declared, "Money does not stink." Still, he ordered better maintenance of public latrines and ensured the sewers, Cloacina's veins, were kept flowing. Over time, as Christianity spread and Roman polytheism faded, Cloacina and her fellow bathroom deities were forgotten. Her shrine crumbled. The graffiti was lost beneath layers of ash and stone. But the fear remained. Across cultures and centuries, the idea that something dangerous lingers in the most private of places endured. Today, we flush without a second thought. But the Romans flushed with fear and faith. Every act of cleanliness was shadowed by something darker, a reminder that even the mundane was sacred, that the gods watched over every corner, even the most unmentionable ones. And for those who dared to forget, the stench, the sickness, or the sudden silence in a crowded latrine reminded them this was not just plumbing. This was holy ground. Rome's sewer workers were social outcasts, but essential. Beneath the marble streets and grand forums of ancient Rome, a different kind of empire thrived, one of waste, rot, and darkness. And within that underworld moved the most invisible citizens of the Roman world, the sewer workers. Known as foricari and cloacini, these men handled the filth no one else dared to face. They scrubbed latrines, unclogged cesspits, and waded into the city's labyrinthine sewers with nothing but crude tools and cloth over their mouths. They were the backbone of Rome's sanitation, but treated as little more than walking refuse themselves. Despite their vital role, these men were viewed with disgust. Roman society, so obsessed with purity and status, shunned those who worked in defilement. Sewer workers were considered ritually unclean. Many were slaves or freedmen, and even those paid for the job were treated as untouchables. Children were warned not to touch them. Priests would avoid them on sacred days. And yet, without them, the city would choke on its own waste. Rome's sewage system, including the colossal Cloaca Maxima, was a marvel of engineering. But it was not self-sustaining. Storms brought debris, toilets backed up, and drains collapsed. The Foricarii were the ones who went in, sometimes crawling through knee-deep sludge to fix blockages or remove dead animals. They carried buckets, hooks, and torches into tunnels where no light reached. The air was thick with methane and disease. Cave-ins were common. And if a sewer flooded, the workers often drowned, their bodies swept away without ceremony. The dangers didn't end underground. Exposure to human waste led to infections, chronic illness, and skin disease. Many sewer workers died young. Their lungs burned with rot and mold, their hands blistered from lime and chemicals. Yet their labor ensured the smooth operation of Rome's public baths, latrines, fountains, and aqueducts. In their absence, diseases like dysentery and typhus would spread unchecked. Some workers were assigned to specific regions of the city. Others were attached to elite households. But regardless of location, their work was hidden, and their existence was inconvenient. Roman writers rarely mentioned them, and when they did, it was usually with derision. They were metaphors for moral decay, invoked in satire and insult. Their real lives, their labor, their suffering, remained uncelebrated, and yet they endured. Cloacini developed rituals of their own, superstitions, to ward off death in the tunnels. Some left carvings in the sewer walls, brief messages to be remembered. Still alive, one reads. My brother fell here, says another. These etchings are some of the only surviving records of lives otherwise forgotten. Above ground, the city flourished. White togas, golden temples, marble baths. But none of it would have been possible without those who trudged through the underworld, clearing paths for clean water and safe streets. They were not statues or senators. They were shadows beneath civilization, and their work, though foul, kept the empire alive. The job of a foricarius was not only dangerous but spiritually contaminating in the eyes of Roman religion. In a culture where cleanliness was linked to moral and ritual purity, handling human waste meant existing in a liminal space, physically necessary, spiritually polluted. These workers were barred from entering certain temples, restricted from participating in civic rituals, and often excluded from traditional burial practices. If a foricarius died on the job, which was not uncommon, their body might be left where it fell or disposed of without rites. Their souls, many believed, would wander in the underworld as restless spirits. The Romans named a goddess after the sewers, Cloacina, the divine protector of the Cloaca Maxima. But even this spiritual acknowledgement did little to improve the social standing of those who maintained her domain. Cloacina's temple stood near the Forum, elegant and perfumed, while her human servants toiled unrecognized in the filth far below. The irony was bitter. Divinity honored, but laborers despised. And yet sewer workers formed communities. They shared tips on how to navigate gas pockets, how to track flow changes that warned of floods. They developed unique slang and warning calls, passing down their knowledge like sacred lore. Some passed the job to their children, not out of pride, but necessity. When you were born into a role like this, few other paths remained open. Society didn't forget your status, even if you left the tunnels behind. What made their endurance remarkable was the sheer scale of their task. Rome was a city of over 1 million people at its height. Thousands of latrines, dozens of bathhouses, fountains gushing in every district. It was all connected by a spiderweb of waterworks. The slightest blockage could bring disaster. When floods hit the Tiber or storms overwhelmed the drains, foricari were sent in first. Not soldiers, not engineers. The lowest caste, the men with buckets, rope, and lanterns. Some survived long enough to gain minor recognition. A few tombstones have been found with inscriptions noting a lifetime of service in sewer maintenance. One man proudly recorded 30 years beneath the city, having trained younger men and survived multiple collapses. His stone, though weathered, carries a simple message. He kept Rome clean. When the Western Roman Empire fell, the knowledge of these systems fell too. Medieval cities would forget how to manage waste properly. Toilets once again became holes over rivers, and disease surged. The foricari disappeared from history. But so did their work, and the world suffered for it. Today, archaeologists crawling through Rome's ancient drains marvel at the stone channels still intact after 2 millennia. They find tools, graffiti, even the footprints of men long dead, embedded in dried sediment. Their shadows still cling to the underbelly of empire, a mute testimony to labor beneath luxury. And so, when we speak of Rome's greatness, let us not only recall the philosophers, generals, or emperors. Let us remember those who walked with torchlight beneath the marble, who bore the city's stench so others could wear perfume, who knew every twist in the dark, every echo of rushing water, and still carried on. The dignity of their labor is found not in how they were remembered, but in the fact that Rome, despite itself, could not survive without them. Toilet breaks were a social activity in ancient Rome. In the bustling heart of ancient Rome, where marble temples towered and chariots thundered over cobbled roads, one of the most surprising sights of civic life wasn't the forum, the amphitheater, or even the bathhouse. It was the toilet. For Romans, relieving oneself was not a private matter, tucked away in silence, but often a communal social experience. Toilet breaks were more than biological necessity. They were opportunities for conversation, gossip, and debate. Roman public latrines were architectural wonders of their time. These facilities, often built near forums, marketplaces, and bathhouses, featured long rows of stone or marble benches with evenly spaced holes. Beneath them flowed a system of running water to carry waste away. There were no partitions, no doors, and no modesty. Instead, people sat shoulder to shoulder, exchanging news, arguing over politics, or mocking local scandals, sometimes for hours. The toilet was a stage for both camaraderie and performance. Inscriptions and graffiti found near latrines confirm that these were places where everything from gladiator scores to imperial decisions was dissected. Friends might meet up at the public toilet as part of their daily routines, the way modern people meet at cafes. While relieving themselves, citizens joked, shared gossip about senators, or voiced suspicions about their neighbors. The sounds of flowing water and distant city bustle formed the backdrop for intimate conversations about war, taxes, and love affairs. The communal design served a functional purpose too. Water troughs ran in front of the benches for washing hands, and a shared sponge on a stick, known as a tersorium, was used in place of toilet paper. This sponge was rinsed in vinegar water and reused by everyone. While that detail may horrify modern sensibilities, the idea of sharing extended even to hygiene. The act of going to the toilet wasn't considered shameful. It was part of public life, woven into the rhythms of the day. Latrines were often decorated with mosaics, painted walls, and even humorous inscriptions. One Pompeian latrine had a sign that read, "Cacator cave malum," loosely translated, "He who defecates, beware of evil." Another warned users not to linger too long. These weren't sterile, isolated stalls. They were vibrant corners of civic culture where laughter and disagreement echoed against stone. Humor and satire were as common in the latrine as in the theater, and perhaps even more honest. Roman philosophers and poets occasionally wrote about these public moments. Seneca, the Stoic thinker, remarked with disdain about men discussing legal matters while seated on latrines. He found it undignified, but the fact that it happened tells us how normal such exchanges were. Martial, the poet known for his sharp tongue, even penned verses about toilet behavior and etiquette, mocking those who took too long or talked too loudly. For the average Roman, there was little divide between bodily function and social exchange. This openness extended to gender as well, though with limitations. While most public latrines were gendered, some bathhouses had shared facilities or spaces where attendants and visitors of both sexes moved freely. Women, too, were part of this ecosystem of social hygiene, though much of their participation is seen through indirect records, due to fewer inscriptions and preserved graffiti in female spaces. Still, archaeological finds suggest that women also engaged in the daily rituals of shared toiletry. For archaeologists, Roman latrines have become gold mines of social data. Coins, dice, amulets, broken combs, and bone pins have all been found in the drains, evidence of what people carried, lost, or deliberately discarded. Even parasite eggs in the waste layers have helped scholars understand ancient diets and diseases. Some scholars believe items like lost rings or jewelry may have been accompanied by whispered curses, turning the latrine into both a restroom and a place of magical reckoning. Relieving oneself could also be a spiritual act. Roman religion involved numerous household and public deities, including those associated with boundaries, thresholds, and transitions. Some minor gods were believed to watch over latrines, including Stercutus, a deity linked to manure and agricultural fertility. Prayers, muttered protections, and ritual gestures were not uncommon, especially in rural areas or at roadside latrines where evil spirits were believed to lurk. Over time, as cultures shifted toward privacy and modesty, the idea of communal toilets faded. By the Middle Ages, sanitation regressed and latrines became more dangerous and isolating. The openness of Roman hygiene was replaced by chamber pots, privies, and fear of miasma. But in Rome, for a brief window in history, the toilet was not just a necessity. It was a microcosm of Roman society. It was where power dynamics, humor, rivalry, and friendship converged over shared stone seats. So next time you step into a quiet single-stall restroom, imagine instead a marble bench, 10 friends at your side, and the latest news of Caesar's court echoing in your ears. The Roman toilet wasn't just about waste. It was about community, connection, ritual, and the everyday practices that held an empire together. Toilets lacked proper ventilation. Diseases spread rapidly. In ancient cities where thousands lived shoulder to shoulder and life pulsed in narrow alleys and crowded courtyards, one structure repeated itself across empires, from Rome to Babylon, from Athens to Mohenjo-Daro. The toilet, a place of necessity, of routine, of human vulnerability. But hidden in its walls and beneath its stone benches was an enemy as deadly as any invading army: disease. The problem wasn't just waste, it was air. Toilets in ancient civilizations lacked what we now take for granted: ventilation. The very design of early latrines, especially communal ones, sealed danger into their foundations. Deep pits, enclosed stone rooms, no chimneys, no air shafts. Just dozens of people using the same space day after day in hot, stagnant air. And in that air, sickness thrived. In Rome, public latrines were masterpieces of civic infrastructure, rows of marble or stone seats, water channels flowing below, sponges soaked in vinegar used communally. They were social spaces where people sat side by side and chatted. But beneath their sophistication lay risk. The constant accumulation of human waste, paired with poor ventilation, allowed harmful gases like ammonia and hydrogen sulfide to build up. The smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was toxic. In some cases, methane gas from decomposing matter ignited, causing explosions in latrines. Roman engineers eventually tried to design systems to channel gases away. But in many structures, the fumes stayed. Mixed with the heat of the Mediterranean sun and the breath of so many people, latrines became petri dishes. Worse, they became incubators for parasites. Flies drawn to the waste landed on food and skin. Worms bred in the moist soil around pits. The poor ventilation meant that fecal bacteria remained airborne longer. Anyone using the latrine could inhale or ingest invisible threats without realizing it. The same illnesses struck again and again: dysentery, cholera, roundworms, tapeworms, and other intestinal diseases. And in cities where drinking water was often drawn from nearby wells or aqueducts downstream of the waste, the entire community paid the price. The Greeks, despite their advancements in philosophy and architecture, suffered the same problem. Their bathhouses and latrines often lacked separation between clean and unclean areas. Latrine fumes seeped into adjacent structures. In some cities, the stench was considered so overwhelming that certain public buildings were avoided altogether. In the East, even the Indus Valley civilization, renowned for its planned cities and early sanitation, struggled with this issue. While their homes included sophisticated drainage systems, many toilet structures were built with closed roofs and few outlets for airflow. Waste was carried through underground drains, but the air above remained still and infected. The consequences were not merely personal, they were societal. Epidemics could begin in the latrine and spread through entire neighborhoods. Children, the elderly, and the malnourished were especially vulnerable. In Roman tenement buildings, or insulae, residents on lower floors were exposed to more waste runoff, while those higher up were trapped in rising fumes. Ventilation was limited by architecture, by ignorance, and by apathy. And yet, despite the obvious dangers, many ancient societies did not fully grasp the connection between air and illness. They spoke of miasma, bad air, but they misunderstood its source. They thought it was spiritual, not biological. Sacrifices were made, incense was burned, but the germs remained. It wasn't until centuries later, with the rise of modern plumbing and the discovery of germ theory, that the true impact of poor toilet ventilation was understood. Until then, millions suffered and died from invisible enemies swirling in the latrine air. Archaeological evidence from ancient latrine sites reveals layers of human tragedy buried in stone and sediment. In Pompeii, fossilized feces found in sewer channels show high concentrations of parasite eggs, evidence that the diseases circulating through the city weren't just bad luck, but systemic failures in design and maintenance. In Herculaneum, a 2-story public latrine showed signs of collapsed airflow systems, trapping gases within its lower vaults. The very infrastructure meant to serve became a tomb. In medieval monasteries, later built on Roman principles, ventilation continued to be overlooked. Monks lived by strict codes of cleanliness, yet many latrines were carved into stone cloisters with narrow ducts and no release for rising gases. Over time, even sacred spaces became infected. The silence of prayer was pierced by the wheezing coughs of men slowly poisoned by the air around them. The design of these toilets reflected more than ignorance. It revealed hierarchy. In wealthier Roman villas, latrines were often built near gardens with open ceilings or vents. But in crowded tenements, the poor relieved themselves in dark cubicles without air, light, or privacy. Disease did not rise from the bottom. It began there and moved upward. Even during outbreaks of plague, when cities were desperate for answers, the focus remained on scapegoats and divine punishment, not the design of the toilets where it all began. When cholera tore through 19th century London, it was traced not to moral decay, but to a single contaminated water pump placed near a cesspit with no ventilation. Centuries had passed, the lesson had not. What these ancient toilets teach us is that sanitation is not just about cleanliness. It is about dignity, justice, and survival. The air in a latrine, though unseen, carries history. It whispers of civilizations advanced in theory but vulnerable in practice, of empires brought low not by rebellion but by breath. And so, the next time you flush and hear the soft hum of a fan or feel fresh air from a cracked window, remember this: that breeze is not just comfort, it's a shield. One earned through thousands of years of pain, ignorance, and death. In the dark corners of ancient stone latrines, people inhaled their fate, and many never walked out again. Emperor Elagabalus built gold toilets, but still no plumbing. In the grand halls of Roman imperial decadence, no figure stands out quite like Emperor Elagabalus, a ruler draped in scandal, excess, and spectacle. Ascending the throne as a teenager in 218 AD, Elagabalus brought with him not just a new religious cult, but a taste for extravagance so extreme it stunned even the jaded aristocracy of Rome. Among his most bizarre and legendary luxuries was the rumored construction of a golden toilet seat, a throne atop a throne. Yet, for all its opulence, this golden seat led to the same gutter as any peasant's. Elagabalus, born Varius Avitus Bassianus, came to power through military manipulation and familial intrigue. As a high priest of the sun god Elagabal in Syria, he brought his eastern deity to the Roman stage, replacing Jupiter at the heart of Roman religious life. But it wasn't just theological disruption that defined his reign. It was a relentless pursuit of pleasure, novelty, and unfiltered eccentricity. His palace was a theater of wealth. He wore gowns made of silk and gold thread, dined on flamingo tongues and pearls dissolved in vinegar, and famously served peas laced with gold flakes. He once installed silver pipes to sprinkle guests with rose water and built a banquet room with a revolving ceiling that rained petals so thick it allegedly suffocated guests. But amidst this opulence, his toilet, reportedly cast in gold, stood as a symbol of both absurd excess and absurd contradiction, because beneath the golden sheen there was no modern plumbing. Rome, even in its engineering brilliance, had yet to devise private, self-contained sewage systems for even the wealthiest homes. Waste from elite latrines, golden or not, still flowed into cesspools or rudimentary sewer connections like the Cloaca Maxima. The emperor, like his poorest subjects, sat above a hole that emptied into a channel, and what made its way out was guided by gravity and crude drainage, not magic. The contradiction was stark. Imagine the emperor surrounded by marble pillars and exotic incense, seated upon a toilet of gleaming gold, while beneath him excrement flowed the same way it did from the latrines of soldiers and beggars. It was a throne, yes, but one that flushed nothing. Servants likely cleaned it manually. Scented oils and burning herbs may have masked the stench. But no matter how gilded the seat, the experience beneath remained thoroughly Roman, raw, shared, and fundamentally practical. Roman plumbing itself was impressive in many ways. Aqueducts carried fresh water for miles. Public baths were marvels of circulation and temperature control, and public toilets used running water to wash away waste. But the system was communal. Wealth could buy decoration, but not true privacy or innovation in waste management. Even in private villas, latrines were stone or wooden seats over pits or channels. The rich simply had better rooms to house them. For Elagabalus, whose life was defined by contradictions, an emperor and a priest, a teenager wielding supreme power, a man said to revel in both masculine and feminine roles, the golden toilet was fitting. It captured everything about his short and chaotic reign: theatrical, absurd, defiant of norms, and ultimately hollow beneath the surface. Elagabalus reigned for only 4 years. His behavior, which included public cross-dressing, controversial religious rituals, and rumored marriages to male partners, alarmed Rome's elite. His political recklessness and disregard for senatorial tradition made him a pariah in his own palace. Eventually, the Praetorian Guard turned on him. He was assassinated in 222 AD, his body dragged through the streets and dumped in the Tiber River. The golden toilet, if it ever existed, faded into legend, an absurd artifact of a reign remembered more for scandal than statecraft. Some historians question whether the golden toilet was real or exaggerated in the scandalous writings of his enemies. Ancient sources like Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta often blended truth with rumor, especially when condemning a fallen emperor. But whether literal or symbolic, the story endures for what it reveals: the dissonance between surface and system, between display and reality. Elagabalus reminds us that luxury does not always equal progress. That gold does not buy escape from the human condition. His toilet may have gleamed, but it could not solve the fundamental problem of waste. The emperor who bathed in perfume still had to sit like everyone else. Beneath the crown, beneath the robes, beneath the eccentric performance, he was human. And Rome, for all its grandeur, remained a civilization still figuring out how to manage its own filth. And perhaps that's the real story behind the myth. Not just that Elagabalus had a golden toilet, but that he symbolized the limits of wealth and illusion. He could change the gods, alter traditions, and bathe in rosewater, but he could not escape the most basic truths of the human body. Gold could not cleanse the waste. Luxury could not replace plumbing. And spectacle, for all its grandeur, could not disguise absurdity. In the end, the golden toilet is not just a relic of decadence, it is a timeless metaphor, a reminder that power often shines brightest when it is most disconnected from reality. Elagabalus didn't fall because of his wealth, but because he mistook it for invincibility. The emperor who ruled with perfume and petals was undone not by rebellion, but by the weight of his own illusion. Graffiti in Pompeii's toilets reveal the Roman sense of humor. Imagine sitting down in a public latrine in Pompeii. The stone is cold. There's no privacy. Dozens of others are seated beside you. But just ahead, scratched into the plastered wall, are words, not solemn prayers or civic notices, but jokes, insults, obscene drawings. One says, "Here I had a good dump, and all I left was this message." Another reads, "Secundus defecated here 3 times." There are crude drawings of body parts, political jabs, even sarcastic advice for how to use a sponge. It's toilet humor, Roman style, and it tells us more about ancient life than any marble statue ever could. The people of Pompeii were not shy. They scribbled on nearly every surface: temple walls, taverns, alleyways, and yes, even latrines. Graffiti was a form of public expression, unfiltered and anonymous, etched directly into the city's living architecture. In bathrooms, it took on a life of its own. Here, amid the smell and sounds, humor became rebellion, a way to deal with discomfort, a way to be human in one of the most undignified of spaces. The jokes were often vulgar, sometimes poetic. One line reads, "If you're reading this, may your hemorrhoids burst." Another says, "Whoever writes here has a tiny member." These weren't written to impress historians. They were written to pass the time, to provoke a laugh, to mock a neighbor, or to leave a strange legacy. And they reveal something timeless. Humor survives even in the dirtiest corners. Archaeologists have cataloged thousands of these graffiti, many found in latrines and bathhouses. Some are jokes about constipation. Others target specific people by name. "Julia does it with anyone," reads one line. "Lucius stinks," another declares. In a latrine near a brothel, one phrase simply says, "Beware of Vibius, he doesn't wipe." The bluntness is shocking, but familiar. If you've ever seen a bathroom stall today, you've seen the modern version. But in Pompeii, this wasn't just vandalism. It was a cultural practice. Literacy was surprisingly widespread among the urban population. Children learned to write with wax tablets. Political candidates paid scribes to paint slogans on walls. But in bathrooms, everyone became an author. With a sharp object and a crude wit, They turned stone into a scroll of laughter, frustration, and identity. Some drawings verge on the artistic. Men with exaggerated anatomy, satirical portraits of gods in compromising poses, toilet demons grinning beneath the rim of a bench. These images were both comic and apotropaic, meant to ward off evil. The latrine was a place of physical vulnerability, but also of psychological relief. Graffiti allowed the powerless to speak freely, to poke fun at elites, to express sexuality, anger, boredom. Even more fascinating is how communal this humor was. People responded to earlier graffiti, adding their own punchlines. One scratch reads, "Marcus was here," beneath it, "and he still owes me 5 coins. And below that, he's hiding in the baths. Check under the 3rd bench." It's like watching a conversation unfold through time, a layering of voices across days, weeks, or even years. In this, Pompeii's latrines were not just toilets, they were forums, raw, open, unfiltered. The Roman sense of humor wasn't all crude. Some graffiti quoted poetry, others offered puns in Latin and Greek. But even these refined scribbles often turned scatological. Humor for the Romans was earthy, grounded. It laughed at the gods, at the body, at itself. And nowhere was this more allowed, more expected than in the toilet. And yet there's something deeply human here, something tender. In these moments of defecation and discomfort, people still wanted to connect, to be heard, to laugh. We tend to think of ancient history as noble, statuesque, distant. But in Pompeii's latrines, it's all too close. The people who lived, joked, and died there were just like us. Embarrassed, bold, funny, alive. Then came Vesuvius. When the volcano erupted in 79 AD, the graffiti stopped, but the walls remained. Preserved beneath ash, the jokes and drawings survived 2 millennia. Today we read them with laughter and a strange sense of kinship. Not because we share their gods or language, but because we share their impulse, to make even the most unpleasant place a little lighter, a little funnier, a little more human. These voices, scratched into walls by ordinary people, reveal a side of Rome we don't often see, playful, irreverent, sometimes cruel, but always alive. They didn't write for posterity, yet posterity came. Their jokes outlasted empires. Their crude humor survived longer than any monument. Even today, tourists in Pompeii crowd around these ancient restrooms, photographing the graffiti, laughing in recognition. Because somewhere in all the ash and ruin, we hear something familiar, a joke made in the dark, a name carved with defiance, a laugh that echoes across time. This is what remains, not glory, not conquest, but comedy. Roman bathroom humor carved into stone as if to say, we were here, we lived, we laughed. And if walls could talk, Pompeii's would still be telling dirty jokes. Ancient latrines used water channels, but weren't self-cleaning. At first glance, Roman public toilets appear impressively advanced, rows of stone benches with carved holes and a constant trickle of water running beneath. These latrines were not simply pits in the ground. They were connected to aqueduct-fed drainage systems, complete with channels designed to carry away human waste. To modern eyes, they look like a marvel of hygiene, but the truth is more complicated. The system may have looked clean, but it certainly didn't stay that way. Ancient Roman latrines used water, yes, but they were far from self-cleaning. In theory, water flowed continuously beneath the benches, washing waste into underground drains that eventually fed into sewers like the Cloaca Maxima. But in practice, water pressure was inconsistent, blockages were frequent, and maintenance was rare. Waste accumulated in corners, sediment built up in pipes, and stagnant pools became breeding grounds for disease. The water that flowed through these channels often came from public fountains, reused bathwater, or cistern runoff. It wasn't always fresh. In dry seasons, water was rationed, and toilet channels slowed to a trickle, or stopped entirely. When this happened, latrines backed up, flooding floors with human waste. The smell could overwhelm entire neighborhoods. Blockages were a constant threat. Human waste, food scraps, broken pots, and even dead animals ended up in latrine channels. Without regular clearing, these materials clogged the system. For Ikari, Rome's sewer and toilet cleaners were forced to descend into the filth with hooks and buckets to restore flow. This labor was not only disgusting, it was dangerous. Toxic gases like methane built up in closed spaces. One wrong move could be fatal. Despite all this, Romans continued to use these latrines in droves. Some cities had hundreds of public toilets. Ostia, for example, boasted dozens of communal latrines located near bathhouses and forums. The largest facilities could accommodate over 20 people at once, side by side, with no partitions. The use was communal, so was the problem. Latrines were rarely cleaned thoroughly. Even when cleared of blockages, biofilm clung to the stone, and residue built up on the benches themselves. Users brought their own cleaning sticks or used shared tersoria, sponges on sticks dipped in vinegar or salt water. But even the rinsing gutter in front of the seats could become a hazard if water flow stopped. Contaminated water splashed easily, and infections were common. Roman writers occasionally remarked on the smell or filth of certain latrines. Martial and Seneca joked about their foulness, mocking rich men who built marble-seated latrines that still reeked. The humor was dark, but based in reality. These toilets were never sterile. They were functional, but flawed. And as the empire grew, so did the strain on infrastructure. The most advanced facilities were often located in military camps or imperial buildings, places with better funding and oversight. But in most towns, toilet upkeep was left to local administrators, who often neglected the job. The result? Clogged drains, vermin infestations, and the ever-present threat of disease. Even the engineering couldn't prevent disaster. During floods, sewers reversed flow, sending waste back up into latrines and even streets. Earthquakes cracked channels, roots from nearby trees invaded pipes. Without constant care, the water that was supposed to cleanse became a source of contamination. And yet, the Romans stuck with this system for centuries. It was still better than nothing. Compared to societies that lacked public toilets entirely, Rome's flawed latrines were revolutionary. But they were never perfect. They were an ongoing battle between waste and water, a war of attrition fought by unseen laborers and ignored by polite society. Aqueducts themselves were masterpieces of Roman engineering. Water was transported over long distances using gravity-fed channels lined with stone and concrete. But while aqueducts powered fountains and public baths, their role in flushing latrines was secondary, often using leftover or recycled water. This meant that the pressure and cleanliness required for a self-cleaning system simply didn't exist. Instead of flushing contaminants away, the water often just spread them around. In wealthier districts, the flow might be stronger, and attendants might sweep waste toward drains. But even there, problems persisted. The slope of the channels mattered enormously. Too shallow, and sediment settled. Too steep, and splashing carried filth up walls and onto clothing. The engineers knew how to build slopes, but uneven terrain and makeshift repairs often introduced errors over time. Once clogged, even the best-designed channel became a trap for rot. And while latrines may have looked sophisticated to visitors, those who used them regularly knew the reality. They stepped over puddles of brackish water. They swatted away flies. They hurried their business not just out of modesty, but to escape the growing stench. The image of Rome as a pristine marble city fades quickly when viewed from the level of its plumbing. After the empire's collapse, many of these systems were abandoned. Medieval cities rarely repaired the channels. Some latrines were bricked up entirely, seen as unholy or unsanitary. But the ruins remain: stone benches, carved gutters, and dry channels, fossilized reminders of a system that needed care, but was forgotten the moment it stopped flowing. So next time you see the stone benches of a Roman latrine, remember, they may look clean now, but in their day they stank. They flooded, they festered, and every flush, if it came at all, was the result of someone else's suffering. Some toilets were designed with footholds for standing use. In the world of ancient sanitation, the toilet was far from a standardized experience. From grand public latrines in Rome to humble roadside facilities in rural settlements, designs varied widely, not just by culture or region, but by posture. While many Roman toilets featured seated stone benches, some toilets from antiquity were built with very different intentions. Archaeologists have uncovered latrines designed with footholes, grooves, or carved footholds, evidence that not all toilet users were meant to sit. These unusual features have been found in latrine remains from various ancient civilizations, including the Roman provinces, Greek settlements, and even sites in North Africa, Anatolia, and the Middle East. Instead of providing a seated bench, these toilets consisted of flat stone or ceramic slabs with 1 or 2 holes cut through, flanked by foot-sized depressions or carved supports. The positioning suggests the user was expected to squat or stand over the hole, aligning their body in a way we might now associate with squatting toilets still used across much of the world. One theory is that these toilets were created for functional or cultural preferences, designed for populations accustomed to squatting rather than sitting. Squatting toilets are still used widely across parts of Asia and Africa today, and they offer certain health benefits such as more complete elimination, reduced strain on the colon, and decreased risk of hemorrhoids. Ancient engineers may have recognized these benefits or simply built what matched local customs passed down over generations. But health wasn't the only consideration. Standing or squatting latrines may have also been a response to hygiene concerns. In shared public spaces, users may have been reluctant to sit on communal benches, particularly during times of plague, lice outbreaks, or heavy use. Standing designs allowed for less skin contact with potentially contaminated surfaces, possibly reducing disease transmission. In certain military camps, temporary latrines with footholds were likely quicker and cheaper to build than seated ones, designed for practicality, not luxury. Interestingly, the placement of foot grooves can also tell archaeologists about the height, size, and even dominant foot of ancient users. Deep grooves worn into one side suggest frequent use or repetitive cleaning habits. In some cases, wear patterns show that users lean slightly or turn sideways, possibly to accommodate long tunics or to avoid contact with rough surfaces. These subtle clues bring modern scholars closer to understanding not just how ancient people relieved themselves, but how they moved, dressed, and adapted to their surroundings. In more upscale or ceremonial complexes, such as palace courtyards or religious temples, foothold latrines may have reflected ritualized behavior. Certain temple toilets appear to have been used in cleansing ceremonies or rites involving purity laws. The squatting posture, combined with cold stone surfaces and minimal decoration, suggests that defecation in these spaces may have held symbolic as well as biological meaning. This link between toilet posture and spiritual posture adds another layer to the complexity of ancient hygiene. Some of the most intact examples have been found in Roman bathhouse complexes, where users may have transitioned from heated bathing rooms into nearby latrines. The warmth and steam of the bathhouses may have made standing more comfortable or desirable. In other locations, such as rural villas, border forts, or desert trading posts, foot-grooved latrines were built over shallow pits and periodically emptied by hand, making seated designs less practical due to rising waste levels and cleaning logistics. There is also a social dynamic to consider. In some ancient communities, squatting was a common posture, not just for toileting, but for resting, eating, or working. The body was conditioned from childhood to move and balance differently than in seated societies. Latrine designs reflected these norms, where elite Roman cities might emphasize comfort with marble benches and flowing water. More remote or rugged settlements prioritized durability and familiarity with squatting methods. Toilet architecture was another mirror of social organization. Religious or ritual customs may have also played a role. In certain belief systems, seated defecation was considered inappropriate or spiritually unclean. Squatting or standing was more in line with notions of bodily control, humility, or separation from impurity. While direct textual evidence is rare, the physical clues suggest a rich spectrum of practices shaped by faith, superstition, and social taboo. What makes these discoveries especially powerful is how they challenge modern assumptions. We often think of seated toilets as advanced, but ancient designs show that sanitation was as much about environment, efficiency, and culture as about comfort. A carved foothold in a dusty ruin may not look impressive, but it speaks volumes. It's a fossil of habit, a trace of a body, a signature of someone's daily life preserved in stone. So the next time you use a sleek modern toilet, remember, the history of how humans go to the bathroom isn't just about plumbing. It's about posture, culture, health, and adaptability. Whether seated on polished marble or balanced over stone grooves, ancient people faced the same biological needs, but met them with a stunning array of innovation. Toilet attendants guarded against thieves and creeps. In the heart of ancient cities, Rome, Carthage, Alexandria, public latrines were more than places of necessity. They were communal spaces woven into the rhythm of daily life. Dozens of people at once might sit shoulder to shoulder, relieving themselves in open rows, chatting, exchanging gossip, even debating politics. But with openness came risk. And in the shadows of stone walls and steam-filled corridors, another class of urban guardian emerged, the toilet attendant. Their job was not glamorous, it was not sacred, but it was essential. Toilet attendants in large bathhouses and public latrines were the unsung enforcers of order in some of the city's most vulnerable spaces. In Roman cities, where facilities could serve hundreds, these workers, often slaves or freedmen, stood vigil not just to keep things clean, but to keep them safe. Because danger lingered where dignity was lowest. Theft was common. People entered public latrines with belts of coins, satchels, sandals, and cloaks. While seated and distracted, these items were easy targets. Pickpockets slipped between benches. Opportunists grabbed sandals and disappeared into alleys. Some thieves posed as users themselves, simply watching and waiting for someone to drop their guard. Attendants watched it all. They were stationed near entrances and exits. Some kept torches lit in dim hours. Others kept clubs behind doorways. They acted as both janitor and sentry, expected to sweep the floors, refill the water jugs, and intervene if someone cried out. At night, their roles expanded. The public bathhouses often stayed open into the late hours, and as darkness fell, so did inhibitions. Fights broke out. Drunkenness turned into harassment. And for women whose facilities were fewer and often shared or nearby, the risk was greater still. Historical sources speak vaguely of guards stationed in bathhouses. Inscriptions describe those who kept watch or maintained order in the latrina. They weren't soldiers, they weren't police, but they stood between privacy and predation. Some attendants doubled as informants. In times of political unrest, they listened to whispered conversations. In other periods, they simply kept the peace. A coin in the right hand might secure a better seat. A few denarii might buy discretion. They knew everything and saw more. And yet their role was thankless. Many were former slaves or impoverished citizens working for temple or city funds. Their pay was meager, their status low. They handled human waste daily. But they understood something few others did. This was where people let their guard down, where they were weakest, and where they most needed protection. Ancient graffiti scratched onto walls of bathhouses even references the attendants. Some mock them, others thank them. Some warn, "Beware the thief with sandals, watch the cloak behind the bench." These messages suggest a world where privacy was rare and vulnerability constant. In such a world, attendants were gatekeepers of dignity. In Rome's largest bathhouses, like the baths of Caracalla and Diocletian, the latrines were vast echoing chambers with polished stone seats arranged in long lines. These weren't private stalls, but communal benches where strangers might sit elbow to elbow. Beneath them ran streams of water designed to carry away waste. But above ground, there were few barriers between comfort and crime. Attendants, sometimes called latrinarii, kept the order. Their tasks were manifold. They lit lamps as dusk fell, collected stray sandals, and sometimes broke up brawls. If someone shouted for help, they were the first to respond. They were expected to know who lingered too long and who wandered too close to others' belongings. And though armed guards were rarely stationed at latrines, attendants often carried clubs, rods, or even slings to deter troublemakers. Some stories describe attendants who foiled robberies by trapping thieves between benches until law enforcers arrived. Others speak of attendants who faced violence themselves, stabbed or strangled by desperate criminals who saw the latrine as an easy target zone. The most dangerous hours came just before dawn, when traffic was light and shadows were deep. Their presence wasn't only practical, it was psychological. Knowing someone stood by offered users a modicum of security. In a space where people were at their most exposed, even the illusion of protection mattered. For women in particular, whose access to sanitation was already limited and often less secure, the presence of an attendant could mean the difference between dignity and danger. In some regions, temple-funded latrines included attendants as a form of ritual service. Bathing and cleansing were linked to spiritual purity, and those who oversaw such spaces took on roles halfway between servant and priest. These attendants were trained not only in maintenance, but in discretion and de-escalation, qualities vital in a society where confrontation could escalate into duels or exile. As empires rose and fell, the tradition of the attendant shifted. In Byzantium, some latrine keepers became minor civil servants, paid modest wages from municipal taxes. In Islamic cities, where public baths, hammams, became integral to urban life, attendants maintained similar roles, guarding against theft and watching for inappropriate conduct. Across cultures, the toilet was never just a toilet. It was a social stage where hierarchies, tensions, and vulnerabilities played out. Yet, for all their value, these attendants were nearly invisible in records. Their names are rarely preserved. Their stories survive only in hints, in fragments of law codes, in the margins of ancient poems, in warnings scratched into clay walls. They were mocked in graffiti, paid in pennies, and remembered in silence. And still, they showed up. They stood in steam, in stink, in shadow. They heard secrets. They saw violence. They held the line between civility and chaos, one toilet at a time. Their job wasn't just guarding space, it was guarding humanity at its most exposed. And in a world of marble statues and imperial conquest, it was these quiet watchers of the waste who held society together, one shift at a time. Roman baths and toilets shared water, creating a contamination nightmare. In the heart of ancient Rome, where opulence met order and public infrastructure rivaled that of modern cities, the baths and toilets stood as a symbol of Roman innovation. Citizens bathed in warm marble chambers, reclined in steam rooms, and relieved themselves in communal latrines, all with the steady murmur of flowing water. But hidden beneath this elegance was a dark and deadly flaw. The same water that brought cleanliness to Roman skin often carried disease to Roman mouths. For in a critical design oversight, Roman baths and toilets sometimes shared water, creating a nightmare of contamination. The Roman public bathhouses, thermae, were among the most magnificent civic structures of the empire. Heated by hippocaust systems, fed by massive aqueducts, and staffed by attendants and slaves, they served as centers of hygiene, gossip, and ritual. Citizens from all classes came to bathe, exercise, or socialize. These baths were supplied with fresh water from aqueducts, but they also reused water through intricate plumbing systems to conserve flow and maintain pressure across the sprawling city. At the same time, public toilets, latrines, were often constructed nearby. These long stone benches with holes emptied into drainage channels, which were flushed with water from the same supply that fed the baths. In theory, it was efficient, but in practice, water flowed in many directions, and not always forward. Recycled bath water was sometimes diverted into latrines to flush away waste. This gray water, already used for bathing, became a secondary tool for sanitation. But when the baths were full or the pressure dropped, water could backflow. Without modern valves or closed systems, waste-laden water from the sewers could creep upstream, contaminating bath facilities, fountains, and even drinking sources. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's central sewer, carried waste from latrines across the city, but it too relied on gravity. In periods of drought, poor engineering, or overuse, it failed. Waste settled. Fumes rose. Bacteria and fecal particles re-entered systems meant to carry them away. In some poorly planned districts, latrines drained into pipes running beneath bathhouses, risking contamination of bathing pools above. The communal nature of Roman hygiene amplified the risk. Dozens might sit shoulder to shoulder in a latrine, sharing the same tersorium, a sponge on a stick used to wipe and rinsed in shared water. In the baths, sponges, towels, and oils were shared freely. Without knowledge of microbes, Romans judged cleanliness by appearance, and while they excelled at removing visible dirt, invisible threats flourished in the gaps. Parasites thrived in warm, moist bathhouses. Fecal bacteria lingered on stone benches. Skin diseases spread easily in tepid water. Those who used the latrine just before entering the bath unknowingly carried bacteria from one realm to another. Children splashed in cooling pools once filled with the runoff of feet, sweat, and occasionally worse. Roman luxury had a microbial cost. Evidence from archaeological sites confirms the danger. Analysis of ancient plumbing shows mineral deposits rich with organic waste. Skeletons buried in Roman cities display signs of intestinal parasites. Latrine pits tested from sites like Herculaneum contain eggs from whipworms and roundworms, passed in human waste and remarkably preserved in time. The same pests likely cycled through the bodies of Roman citizens who shared baths and toilets day after day. Some Roman writers hinted at the danger. Pliny the Elder noted strange illnesses from stagnant water. Galen warned of fevers linked to proximity with waste. But without the tools of microbiology, Romans blamed bad air, miasma, not waterborne pathogens. The link between sanitation and sickness remained speculative, buried under incense and civic pride. Ironically, the more advanced Roman plumbing became, the more invisible the danger grew. Underground tunnels made waste seem distant. Aqueducts made water seem infinite. And the constant hum of public infrastructure gave citizens confidence that all was well. But beneath the marble, bacteria bloomed, silent, unseen, unstoppable. Even elite villas were not immune. Wealthy Romans built private baths and latrines connected to the same shared water systems. Their opulence couldn't guarantee safety. In fact, their desire for fountains, mosaics, and perfumed water may have introduced more complex plumbing and more points of failure. It wasn't until centuries later in post-Roman Europe that sanitation regressed fully. The loss of aqueducts, baths, and sewer systems led to new horrors of hygiene. But the illusion that Rome had perfected sanitation hides the truth. Their system was vast, yes, but not foolproof. And their reliance on shared water, without full understanding, made their most civilized rituals vectors for disease. Today, archaeologists continue to study the remains of Roman plumbing with awe and caution. The brilliance is undeniable, but so is the flaw. In their quest to conquer nature, the Romans brought water to the city, but could not yet see the life within it. They shared baths and toilets in pursuit of cleanliness, but in doing so, often seeded infection. The next time we marvel at Roman baths, the mosaics, the chambers, the pools, let us also remember what the ancients did not yet know. That water, without knowledge, can cleanse or kill. That even the most majestic systems can carry the most microscopic threats. And that beneath every innovation there lies a lesson written not just in stone, but in sickness.